All right. You guys have stamina. You're sticking with this. That's very good. Just to give you a little context about today, we, throughout this week, we started with exits, and then we filled out some of the other things with pro formas and finance and valuation, and those are all due diligence. So we have been doing due diligence, and we've been talking about the things that we do due diligence all week long. So now I'm just sort of moving to a different level, and we'll talk just about the process, and I will go back and forth between investor perspective and entrepreneur perspective. All of the things we have been doing all week are, of course, for investor and entrepreneur. And this, for due diligence, there are some things that investors need to do, and then of course you'll get the message, but the main thing that entrepreneurs need to do is to be preparing for due diligence so that there are no surprises. Interestingly, all of the things we've been talking about this week are preparing for due diligence. Having your exit strategy, your pro forma, your go-to-market strategy, we didn't do, but all of those things are part of preparing for due diligence. And then I'll give you some more detail. One of the things that I will provide to Olga, who will provide to you, is the due diligence checklists. And I'll be talking about some of the items that are on the checklist, but there are about 100 due diligence checklist items. And these are things like your articles of incorporations or bylaws or marketing plan, pro forma, any contracts, things like that. I'll talk about those in specific. But it sounds intimidating that this is a 100, actually maybe almost 120 items on this checklist. The typical company will not actually need all 120. This is absolutely everything that any investor could ever ask for. So it might have things about labor unions. You probably don't have a labor union, but that's one of the items of the checklist. So it's just something to look at. Most companies have something like, out of the entire checklist, maybe 35 or so, 38 is a normal number of items that they need to supply. So, and I'll talk more about how that works. So, and as Olga said, please just interrupt as we go along. Makes it fun and engaging and not just having to listen to me for 3 hours straight. And I can do it, so look out. All right, so let's talk about what due diligence is. And, I think when I think about due diligence, the very first time due diligence starts is when I meet a founder for the first time, or when I open an email that they've sent me, or maybe a pitch deck that they've sent, or in my case, I have a platform where people will go in and they will enter some data about their company, and I will go and look at that. Whatever that first touch point, due diligence begins right then. I showed you the other day a chart of 10 steps, from pitch to investor interest, to deep dive, and then due diligence was number 4 of the 10 steps. So it made it look like it's this, period of 2 or 3 weeks where the due diligence team does their due diligence, they produce a report, and then due diligence is over. Well, that could not be farther from the truth. It is true that is due diligence. It's documentation, it's very intensive research, but due diligence really is every single interaction between investor and entrepreneur that happens. So always you're under the microscope and being observed and watched, and we are learning. So one other thing I want to say about due diligence is a lot of people think that the purpose of due diligence is to take a pipeline of deals and narrow it down and to weed out the bad, or not even, maybe just not ready companies, not appropriate for whatever the investor's intent is. And it is true that is part of the purpose of due diligence, but throughout all of this, I want you to remember that a big part of due diligence is to find the good stuff and to think, well, why should I invest? And so a part of the due diligence report should always be, why I like this deal. And I always like to start with positive things, and then of course you go in and find all the dirt and talk about that. But the first page of a due diligence report that I prepare usually has a, why I like this deal, so it gives some context. Because if I don't like the deal, I'm not going to spend weeks doing all of this work, right? So just want to make that clear to people that I'm co-investing with. Let's see. The other thing, just about finding the good stuff, is usually I expect that the companies that I am working with know a lot more about their industry than I do. So I know about investing, and I know about companies and scaling and growing and all of these things, but I don't know about how peptides work in making therapeutics or whatever drugs or whatever. It all looks. I love the slides that life science companies put up, and I'm like, I have no idea what this is about. And yet, I look for validation from others for that sort of thing. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So next thing, I mentioned this the other day when we were talking about due diligence, and a lot of people say that for early stage companies, due diligence doesn't matter. And I hear people say this all the time. And I said it the other day, but I'll reiterate that it matters a lot. And it matters for a bunch of reasons. And probably the most has to do with this idea of due diligence being, as I say, the best free consulting you'll ever get. It involves being asked questions that you probably haven't thought of as a founder. And it involves having your hypotheses be tested. And really, nothing will be taken for granted. And things that you hoped maybe you could sweep under the carpet and hide from conversation, those will be usually brought out into daylight. And by doing that, it makes your strategy, your company, much stronger. And this is why companies who do receive funding are typically so much more successful because they have done a lot of this planning and have had to go through this fairly rigorous process. As I work with companies, we have one type of due diligence, by the way, I'll just share with you, it's unique. A typical due diligence process is about 2 or 3 weeks, as I said, and it involves researching all of these things. But we have a thing that we call a due diligence rally that is a one-day due diligence. The entire due diligence happens in one day. And the way it works is we get a whole room of investors, about this many investors, and then we have a conference room, and the company and all of the people in the company will go in there, and maybe you guys might be the marketing team, and you're the investors who are going to be doing the diligence on that, and you'll go in and meet with the team, the company for half an hour, 45 minutes, whatever it takes. Question, and then you go back and you start writing up your report. And then you guys might be the finance team. You go in with the company, ask a lot of questions, and then you come back and you start writing your report. And you might be, the markets or competition, whatever it is. And throughout the day, it's just question after question after question. It is a marathon for startup founders. And I see 2 responses from the founders. Some are like, oh my God, what a nightmare. It was all of these hard questions all day long. It was exhausting. And other people come out and go, oh my God, this was the best thing ever. I got so many great ideas, and I really, met so many interesting people and found it to be super valuable. So my advice to founders is be that second person and think of this as something that's really fun and is there to help you regardless of whether the investors end up investing or not. It's positive regardless. So, has anybody heard this term spray and pray for investors? And what it is one of the things, if you have a venture capital fund, you have to create a portfolio strategy. And one of the things that is part of your portfolio strategy is you're going to have X amount of money. Well, how many companies are you going to invest in? And there is sort of a bell curve of where venture funds are, but there are many, many different types of venture funds, and some will invest in only 5 to 10 companies. So very concentrated, very few. Then there will be some who will invest in 50 or 100 companies. And this is what we call spray and pray. if you're going to invest in 50 or 100 companies, unless you have 100 people on your general partner, you don't have time to do the due diligence on all of those companies. And frankly, 100 means you probably looked at 10,000 companies if you really, had the 100 to 1 ratio that most investors have, which, think about it, that's an insane amount of work. And so that's why we call it spray and pray, because you're not doing due diligence and you don't have time to really be helping, coaching, consulting with the companies. All you're doing is writing off a lot of checks really fast. And that's why they call it spray and pray. It's just like you're spreading it evenly across a ton of companies and you pray that maybe some of them will do well. And that's the spray and the pray. And it's funds that do that, in my observation, do not typically have very good results on their investment. Yes?
There's such a fund in the region, based in Croatia, so they do spray and pray strategy. They write checks very quickly and they have a number of investments, but you can't really follow the investments. You can't really add values as a VC fund.
Yeah. So if you've gone through due diligence with some other VC, then you can go to those guys and get your spray and pray check, which is all good, right? I mean, don't say no to the check, but I'll just say the due diligence process with real venture capitalists will be actually a valuable part of what happens. So most VCs will end up with a portfolio of somewhere between 20 or 30 companies. Some are 15 to 25, whatever. But that's where the top of the bell curve is for a standard distribution in terms of risk. And what that means is that VCs can spend time, because they're going to do those say 25 investments, maybe over 5 years. So that's only 5 investments a year. They have plenty of time to meet companies, dig in deep, ask questions, and also provide that support later on. All right, so my picture didn't work on this, but it was just a picture of a check with beer on it. Just saying, there are a lot of investors who really are unsophisticated and they will just have dinner with you, have beer with you, and write a check. Go ahead, take that money. But again, it's best if you have a lead investor who has set the terms and who has done this due diligence with you. And I'm just going to pause for a second because I haven't really talked this week about syndicate formation and how syndicates and how investments work together. I've said a couple of times that when an investment is made, the investors all invest at the same terms at the same time. It's not like, oh, I got a term sheet from you for $5 million and one from you for $4 million, so I'm going to hope that you give me most of the money because you had but I'll still take your money at 4. It's not like that. You have a lead investor typically who will set those terms and then everybody else will follow them. The lead investor usually is the first investor, often is the largest, but not necessarily. But the one thing to keep in mind is it ain't over till it's over. And what that means is your lead investor may say, all right, I'm investing you at $5 million. And then a bunch of other people come along, and then somebody who wants to invest a lot says, I'd love to give you $1 million, but I think you're only worth $3 million. And if that is something that makes sense to you, then all of the other investors will be at the $3 million if you decide to do that. And I'm just making up these numbers, right? But just letting you know, whatever the last negotiated deal is, that's what everybody gets. So it's hard to find somebody who is willing to be the lead or who has the expertise to be the lead. And I have, even in Colorado, I have a lot of companies who come to me and they say, Peter, I have 5 investors who say they want to write a check, but they won't lead the deal. And they don't feel comfortable writing the term sheet, they don't feel comfortable coming up with the valuation, and they're looking for someone else to do it. And that's something I always like to do, so it's a good thing. And there are people who focus on that. Yeah?
Why is that? They feel that they are incompetent, or they feel that they'll mess up and somebody will, let's say, make them accountable for that?
Well,
is it personal,
yeah.
or is it...
you know, incompetent has a negative connotation, but that's actually the correct. I think they recognize they don't have the skill, and they don't feel comfortable valuing the company, or you know, some of the terms are we'll just talk about them in a little bit. They don't feel comfortable with that. So I think that's the main reason. They want somebody who has experience in doing that. So when companies pitch with us, we want to see at least maybe a dozen investors who've raised their hand to say, yeah, I'm interested in following this deal. And at least one investor will say, yes, I'm willing to lead this deal. And that might be guiding the due diligence team and helping them with the questions that they want to ask. It might involve being part of the negotiation and term setting. It may be being part of the cat herding of corralling up all the other angels and, you know, just sort of keeping momentum going on the deal. But those are some of the parts of the lead investor. Yes?
Yeah. In some cases, some of the other investors which are not willing to take the lead is because they don't have local presence. So usually they will trust the company which has people in the place, which are familiar with the market, which are more familiar with the company. They would like to be part of the deal, but they don't have local presence. So they say, okay, we trust you, you're doing the good thing about the due diligence, about the deal structuring. We would like to support the company, we would like to do, but you are the leader in the deal.
Yeah. Yes?
Are there some legal responsibilities for the leader, like some contracts, or this is all based on trust and on leadership skills?
So not typically. Technically, in venture capital, everybody is a grown-up, and you know, that's why there's the whole accredited investor thing, is that VCs, of course, have other people's money, and angels have their own money, and they are assessed or believed to be having enough that they can lose their money without being homeless. So I think some groups I know who work with each other, when one group is leading, they have a hold harmless agreement, just a one-page thing that says, I acknowledge, thank you for sharing, for leading, thank you for doing these things, but I agree I won't sue you for anything. You know, in the US, everybody sues everybody for everything. It's crazy. Yeah. But I will say I almost never ask for those. If somebody asks me for that, I'm happy to sign a hold harmless agreement. I'm not really worried about somebody suing. For somebody leading and maybe having done a term incorrectly or set a price that wasn't, you know, the optimal price, well, you're an idiot for coming in and following my lead. You're responsible for that. You know, you can sue, but not worth it. And especially at the stage that I'm investing at, where it's, you know, it's pre-seed and seed, these deals are not that big, and it will cost more in attorney's time than the people invested most of the time. So that's why I feel comfortable that probably people won't be suing me.
That's my second question. In a situation where we say you're in a check, how much caution should the founder have, co-founders, the company have to seek for legal guidance to close the deal with the beer and a check guy professionally, let's say?
Yeah. So here's a couple things. First of all, question about you know, how much legal advice should you get from attorneys? You should get legal advice from attorneys. That's absolutely, you know, if the beer and a check guy writes you a check, and this happens all the time, say, you know, here's 25,000 euros or whatever, I'd like to be part of your company. I've seen people do that, and they don't even know, they don't even ask, well, how much is a share of your company and how many shares will I get? And they're just thinking, oh, I'll just invest. And I've seen people do that. It's kind of shocking. And so the attorneys need to be there to create the right documentation to make sure that the deal is good for everybody. The last thing you want is somebody getting amnesia and, you know, maybe you have a big exit 5 years later and they say, oh yeah, well my $25,000 was for 50% of the company, and you're like, no. So you want to definitely have everything nicely documented. So, okay, so once again, the syndication team, there's the lead, bunch of followers, people who are writing checks, and then there is sometimes the due diligence is done by the lead, sometimes a consortium of followers, or in our case, we actually have a professional due diligence team who will actually do the writing. Ironically, and I'll just tell you this because it's kind of counterintuitive, the worst due diligence reports come from investors. You'd think, why is that? And this is angel investors I'm talking about, not VCs. And the reason that most of them that I've gotten from them are so bad is, well, the angel investor is thinking, oh, I just want to get to the point where I'm going to say I'm in or I'm not, and then they stop. Whereas, you know, somebody who is working on this and doing all the research, they will take it all the way to the end. They will write it very nicely, knowing that this is to share with other investors to use as a document. But angels just go, I'm good, and then they stop, and they only do half of the report. So there you go. Just interesting discovery on my behalf. So that's the team. Everybody gets together. But let's talk about the beer and a check guy. It's okay if the beer and the check guy or the spray and pray guy comes at the end of that process and joins on to this collection of people. But sometimes the beer and the check guy is your only guy. If they come, they give you $25,000, you don't have anybody else. This is not necessarily a good situation, especially if it's not a sophisticated investor, because if you haven't done the work we talked about yesterday with figuring out what your own valuation should be, or you haven't done the work we'll do this afternoon with learning all of the terms and negotiating the terms properly, you might find yourself making a very expensive $25,000, investment, because it may end up costing you more than you thought. So just a caution there. If you have a good attorney, I find very few attorneys know how to value a company or really understand venture very much at all. But if you do have a good attorney who's done a lot of these transactions, that will help. All right. So next one. So for founders, you should be doing due diligence on your investors as well. And certainly, when founders come to me, I really appreciate it when they've looked at my portfolio. You can look at it online. You can see the types of companies I've invested in. I get a lot of emails that say, hey, Peter, I see you've done a lot of investments in X, and I have a company that does X. Here's what we do. Would you like to talk? So doing that level of due diligence is good. But you can also think, is this a good relationship? All of these logos of companies that Peter invested in, is he a jerk? Or do they like him and does he help? And so you can actually just look these companies up, find the CEO, and actually call those people and say, I see you got an investment from this company. What do you think? So you can do background checks on your investors just like they will do them on you. Okay. I had this chart up the other day, so I'll just cover it quickly. But the point of this chart was heavy due diligence is going to result in these green bars in the 10, 20, 30x returns. Low due diligence is going to be these blue bars, which are less than 1x or in the 1 to 5x. So the point being, does due diligence pay? Does it pay to spend the time doing it? Yes. Statistically, it makes a big difference. So this is the chart I use for the people who say there's nothing you can look at, there's nothing you can do in due diligence. In fact, this study, it's almost too good to be true to believe, but if you read this, and I know you can't, this is why I'll tell you what it says, but overall multiple for high diligence was 5.9x, which is incredibly high for a portfolio of companies. And then overall multiple for low due diligence is 1.1x, which is not surprising. So that's a 5 point something time difference. So if I invested, $100,000, I'd end up with $500 and something thousand with high diligence across the portfolio, or I'd just about get my money back. I'd get 110,000 back with low diligence. So spray and pray. You got to be a real good prayer. All right. So I think we talked about this the other day, but I'll just say angels versus VC in due diligence. The angels sometimes do more, sometimes do less. And as company founders, there are things you can do to control how much time is spent in due diligence. And the main thing, and I'm going to say this 10 times today so you really get this idea, is to prepare and have all of your documents ready. So when the formal due diligence process starts and the first document is requested, you can say, great, here's the data room, you can have everything. Except for maybe your secret sauce, which I'll talk about later. All right, so when we talked about valuation yesterday, I talked about how valuation is part art, part science. Well, due diligence is also part art and part science. So a lot of it is about intuition as well as about math and markets and all of that. And I'll just tell you a story about one. I'm not a big intuition guy in general in terms of things that don't make sense that happen, but this one person I was doing diligence on, I was looking at the resume and I saw that he said he was at school at Metro State University in Denver. And I thought, I'm going to call the school and find out if he's actually in school. So I called, checked to see if he was enrolled, and surprise, he was not. So he had, and people of course sometimes embellish their resumes. But the odd thing is, I have never checked any founder ever to see if they actually went to the school they said they did. But there was just some weird intuition. I said, I don't think he's actually going to this school. And sure enough, he wasn't. So, but that's not the type of weird intuition I'm talking about. Some of it is, there's a feel you get, and I'll share another story. There was a founder, I was asking a lot of questions, and I was asking a question, this is the middle of a circle. This was my question, and his answers were here, 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 here. He talked all around my question, but never would answer the actual thing. And so my intuition said, this guy is not straightforward. And sure enough, it turned out that the product that he was creating had a patent by Boston Scientific that he was violating. And that was the type of thing I was digging into. He was, there was no way he could be successful. Boston Scientific would have put him out of business. So sometimes when you get this intuition, because people aren't answering your questions directly, I don't like companies who are not clear and crystal clear in how they answer, but I also, if they're being evasive, I think that's super, super scary. I'll say most founders don't lie, but a lot of founders will obfuscate, which is they will try to avoid answering a question, or they'll answer it in deceptive ways, maybe not uttering an actual untruth, but not uttering the truth. And so that's the kind of thing that investors need to be looking at. Let's see.
Very good position, but it works both ways. Why? Because we don't want to overpromise sometimes. I have a situation, for example, where I'm asked, can you do this? And I said, I cannot say yes. I want to say yes, because I feel that it is so, but if I don't see it working, I cannot say it is.
That's different. That's being hyper honest, and you're actually daylighting what the uncertainty is, which probably both of us can see when we're having a conversation. And so when you say, I can't say for sure yes, awesome. That's really good.
Also, it is not mine to say, because other people, if it's a regulatory thing, they have to check and confirm.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. I love when somebody says, all right, well, here are the risks. I perceive these risks. Here's what we're doing about them. But I, of course, can't tell you for sure it's going to go one way or the other. So
So that's not over.
no, that's really good. That's a green flag for me. That's A, awareness, B, openly discussing it, and C, talking about what your strategy is to deal with that uncertainty. So those are all really good intuitive characteristics. Unless on the analytical side, it turns out you have a 1% chance of succeeding, and nobody has ever succeeded and you haven't come up with something different, maybe you'll lose out on the analytical side, but probably not. You would have figured that out by now and wouldn't be trying to start a company doing something that won't work. All right, so just a few other things. A lot of the things we've talked about, but we haven't talked about background checks. I find a lot of really interesting things in background checks, and sometimes it's really hard, especially if you're working with international people. I had one company who came to us from Australia. There was just something weird about it, and we did a ton of due diligence, and we finally found a newspaper article written in Sydney talking about how this CEO had been convicted of securities fraud and put in jail for many years. And here we're going to enter into a securities transaction with them. Not a good idea. So, a lot of times we'll do background checks. We'll see, bankruptcies, speeding tickets. Speeding tickets are, of course, okay, but I've seen people who have felony assault convictions. I'm probably not going to invest in those people. Or shoplifting 2 years ago, I'm not going to invest in those people. If it was 20 or 30 years ago, maybe that was different, but this is what you look for. All right. I already referenced this. Due diligence, everything is all due diligence. The entire damn thing, due diligence. All right, so before companies get to formal due diligence, I'm going to talk more about this, but getting your stuff together is important. This is key, and I mentioned this yesterday, figuring out what the 2, 3, 4 big risks are for your company. We talked about it as the risk stairs and that valuation method, but you should actually write those down and figure out what your biggest risks are and what your mitigation strategies are. Because if your investor hasn't asked you what about these 3 big risks, it's probably a good idea for you to bring them up. And I know this sounds absolutely insane, but showing that awareness again and mitigation is actually a plus rather than a minus. And the investor may be thinking about that risk, and that risk may be bothering them, and maybe they're not articulating it or saying it, but maybe they're secretly deciding not to invest because they're worried about it, and maybe they don't want to embarrass you and ask about it. This happens. So you should know your top 2, 3, 4 big risks and actually discuss those with the investor at the appropriate place. So I know we have a bunch of impact people here in Skopje, so I just put in a couple of slides on impact. And when we're doing due diligence, I'll just say, for me, I am looking business, exit strategy, all of that, and then I want to know I'm going to do some due diligence on the impact part. And I've talked to companies who I start analyzing the impact, and it turns out it's not really very much impact. And why are you presenting yourself as an impact company? This seems really strange. And so having a strong commitment to measurable outcomes is super important. Well, I've had another slide, I thought. Well, we'll get to it. So I guess that's it for that. All right, so red flags. So I think of these 2 things, red flags, green flags. Red flags are something that just stops, due diligence is over. So when I think about due diligence, it's kind of like one of those games where you're doing the marble through maybe you have this, where it goes around a maze and it falls through holes. Well, when you hit one of these red flags, maybe a founder has told a lie, or there's securities fraud, or shoplifting within the last 2 years, that's game over. So due diligence, how long does it take? it takes to get to one of those red flags, and then once you've found one of those things, you're not going to say, all right, well, we've got 2 weeks budgeted, let's keep on going. It's just not going to continue. So this is sort of one of the things that we will use as part of our due diligence process. We'll daylight what we think the big risks are, and we'll send this to companies, and then we'll say, why we think they're risks, and we'll ask the companies to respond back to that. Just helps to be transparent. The other thing is, we talked about this yesterday. You saw this chart. It was on the venture capital method tab of the valuation workshop. But the one thing I wanted to point out is there's this zone here of where things work, and it's this sort of goldenrod yellow type color. And so this is just looking at number of years, 5 years, 10x, 58%, IRR. So I see a lot of things. One of my first filters is it falling over here? Is it a 30%, 24% IRR? And by this, is it a 24% IRR? Of course, we're looking into the future, but if the projected exit is going to return 24% best case, I'm not going to pursue this deal anymore. And I have a lot of people who will present deals like that. So it's just an immediate no. I won't even look at the deck if I can figure out what the deal is. So I have this thing I call meta due diligence, and it isn't due diligence proper, like doing background checks or whatever, but it's observing how the company responds to due diligence. And I had a due diligence team lead who every now and then he would call me and goes, Peter, I've got a meta due diligence problem. And usually what he was talking about was a company who we'd moved into diligence and they just wouldn't send the diligence documentation. And you're thinking, why not? If they're not performing before we've even written a check, it's probably not going to be a great relationship afterwards. And maybe it's the case that they're just scrambling and trying to find a fractional CFO and create a pro forma, but they should just say so and maybe go next in the due diligence queue as opposed to trying to fake their way through it, which is never a good thing. So looking at how people respond, we send a list of inquiries. Here's the key risks. What do you think? How do you respond? And then it's weeks and weeks before we get a response back. Meta due diligence says this company is not really on top of it, probably not a good investment risk. I wouldn't make the entire investment decision about how fast a response came back, but sometimes it really does take weeks and weeks for something that might take just an hour or so of work. So this is super important. I get a lot of questions from people about skeletons in the closet. And if you know this metaphor, it means something that could be perceived as being bad, but it's kind of hidden away. And people will come to me and they'll be sort of sheepish and they say, I had a bankruptcy 20 years ago. I guess you don't have bankruptcies here, you just, whatever. But in the US, they had that, and that's on their credit record, so it will show up. And they're just like, should I reveal this, or how do I deal with this situation? I want to be transparent. And I usually say, well, this is good. You did the first thing, which is just to not try to hide it away, because we will find it anyway. And by being transparent, sometimes it will be a material fact, sometimes it will not. One thing that's important, though, is understanding what investors perceive as being a skeleton and what they don't. So something like a bankruptcy is pretty clearly a bad thing on somebody's credit record, but having two people on the leadership team who are related, either husband and wife or father, daughter, or whatever, that is a material skeleton that might be perceived as something that could be a risk, and it is something that should be revealed early on. It is an item on the due diligence checklist, so we make it hopefully easy that these things won't surprise you. But we did have a company, it was a husband and wife team, and we were helping them through due diligence, and a VC actually flew out from California to meet with this team and see what the company was doing. And after the meetings, they said, "Hey, you want to come back to our house, and we'll make you dinner." And the investors were like, "Your house? You live together?" And they're like, "Yeah, well, we're married, of course." And the investors hadn't known that. They had different names, different last names, and frankly, some people look like their spouses, but these people really didn't look like people you would have guessed would be married. And the investors were really they didn't like the idea of husband and wife teams, but even more so, they didn't like the fact that this couple had, in their eyes, hidden it from them. These people had multiple companies together before. They'd shown that they could work together. It was not an issue, but the fact that they didn't reveal it ended up killing the deal. Investors went home, didn't pursue the deal anymore. So that's how to think about that. All right, so founders, how to prepare for due diligence. Should be 100% ready before you start. So go through the 100-point checklist, get all the documents, put them together. I'll talk more about that. There are probably things you don't have. And so it's not just a matter of finding a document and putting it in somewhere. It will be, even more importantly, a matter of working with a fractional CFO or working with your attorney to make sure you've got all of these things put together. Get everything ready, and only then should you pitch. You should assume that if you're pitching to investors, that they're going to be interested, and the next day they might be thinking, all right, let's go into due diligence. Here's what I want. Here's 10 documents. Please send them. And so, good idea to have these done way in advance. So I'll talk about what some of these things are. Yeah.
That was told if you are just sensing who is interested. For example, I'm planning to get investment, but it's basically not the moment to do it. But I'm having it in, let's say, a month or two from now. And is it okay if somebody asks for due diligence, to do due diligence at that moment, when you show just interest, not to pursue it, but to wait for a couple of months? Or is it a red flag?
I'm not sure I totally understood that question, just to be clear, but I think what you're saying is, if you're just having sort of a soft meeting with somebody, do you still have to get everything all put together?
But you are expressing that it's a soft meeting, and you're just pointing out that you have something and that you'll follow up later.
Yeah, that would be fine. And it's good to have those meetings. Say, look, we're not raising now. We're looking to start at the beginning of the year. Then great. Have that conversation, and keep in mind, by the way, this advice I think is probably one of the most important pieces of advice. Get everything all ready. But among your peers, most of the companies that are talking to investors have not done this. So just so you know, I'm just telling you how to succeed and to compete well for limited dollars among other startups. Most will not do this. But by doing it, you will be more likely to win. So this is why I give you this advice. And guess what? You've got to prepare this data room for your first raise. 18 months later, you're going to need this data room again. 36 months, you'll need the data room. And 5 years later, when you're being acquired, guess what your M&A acquirers are going to want? Data room. So this doesn't stop. You put it together, and of course you're updating it continuously, but it's not just something you have to put together for this one raise. It is something that is.
For a physical data room, or it can be digital?
I guess I have seen a physical data room, and it was weird. It was loose leaf binders, and that was a pain in the ass. So no, I mean people have to sign them out and sign them back, and all of this stuff. Better just to get a password to a online thing. Much easier for you and better for the trees.
Much cheaper not to have extra room for that.
Yes, yes. Oh, here's a slide. I don't know why it's here six slides later. But just if you are an impact company, you should have almost what I call an impact pro forma, talking about whatever the good is you do. Well, how much of it are you going to do in the first year, second year, third year? And it's interesting to see how positive social or environmental impact scales with revenues and sales and all of those other things. So being able to clearly describe if you are talking to impact investors, this is absolutely critical. I am shocked when I see impact companies who haven't thought about their metrics. So this is something most companies will not do, but I just put it in here because it's super important. All right. Oh, and here's this picture of this game I was talking about with the marble. Game over when your marble falls through a hole. That's what due diligence is like. All right.
How would impacts be perceived if the company is not impacted?
It's not relevant. Most companies are not impact companies. So it's just when you are talking to impact investors, you need to talk their language. And frankly, if I were an impact company, my main deck would be a non-impact deck. I would just talk about financials, my market, my moats, my competitive, barriers to entry, all of those things. And then if I was pitching to people who were known to be impact investors, I would have my impact deck that would have all the KPIs and metrics. Impact can be a negative thing for some investors who think that founders of impact companies are having non-profit-y sort of mentalities. So, but like you guys are an impact company, but you don't present as one, right? So that's just right. All right, so just quickly, it's phase one, get your stuff together. 2, get all the questions together. If there are, in addition to the due diligence questionnaire, checklist, we also have due diligence questionnaires. And this is super helpful for you. You don't need to actually write out all these things, but it's several pages of the most common questions that VCs will ask you. And so as a team, you might want to go through those questionnaires and actually, answer amongst yourself, partly to answer the questions, but also to make sure your team is aligned on your position on those things. So when due diligence is progressing, there will be deep dives and site visits. I was just going to tell a story here. I had one site visit I went to. It was a life science company, and when I got there, the tour around the labs, it was very professional. People had their white lab coats and lots of machines all over doing things and very life sciencey. But the whole tour was the CEO was so proud that all of these machines all over he had bought from other life science companies that had gone out of business. And he goes, this machine is $100,000. I got it for $10,000. And the entire room was sort of a garage sale of life science machines. And so I was thinking, this is a guy who will be an excellent steward of our money. He's getting just what he needs to solve the problems he needs without having to have the shiniest brand new things. All right, so NDAs, non-disclosures, this will invariably come up in some companies' discussions. So let's just say a few things. If a company doesn't have strong barriers to entry, if it doesn't have intellectual property, copyrights, patents, huge data sets or network effects, or something that makes it really hard to copy what your company does, it's probably not going to be a very good investment. Why? Because once you enter into the market, somebody else will just copy you, and the company who is going to acquire you has to make this decision. Am I going to pay many, many multiples of revenue for this company when we could actually just pay some developers for 6 months of work and have this same thing ourselves? So you need to think about what those moats are, those barriers to entry that make it so that others can't copy easily what you do. And they're different for every type of company. But without that, your exit is not going to be a good one. So NDAs, there is a time when a non-disclosure agreement might be acceptable, and usually it's later on in due diligence. And when somebody asks me for an NDA, right at the first interaction, that seems very strange to me. If somebody can't describe their business at a high level, then clearly they don't have a moat. They don't have that barrier to entry. And if they can't even tell me about, in general, what their business is, once they launch, then others will copy, it'll go away, and it won't be a very good exit. So there's multiple different ways of thinking about that. All right, so documentation, diligence reports, next stage of diligence. These are the typical chapters of a due diligence report. I've seen a lot of different reports. Some have extra things or they don't have something here, but basically the business summary, go-to-market strategy. This is one of the most important parts. Go-to-market is, I think, one of the biggest risks at pre-seed sort of angel level investment. And the reason is that the company has typically been working on tech, and getting their MVP or their prototype product prepared. So they are all thinking about product and technology, and they maybe have not done much work on go-to-market. So I really want to see a very deep and sophisticated go-to-market strategy. For me, this is often way more exciting than the product. Just for startups, it seems weird, but go-to-market, if I see somebody who what they've done is figure out a unique way to sell something, sometimes that's the genius in the company, and the product doesn't matter. Team and people, next thing. So in your data room, you'll have all your CVs or resumes of all the people. If you have employment contracts, you'll have those in there. And when we do background checks, we'll include those in the report. Things about the product and tech, if there's patents or whatever, if there's bill of materials, sort of understanding how much the cost of goods are for something versus the retail price, that's important. The market size, TAM, SAM, SOM, who's in there, what the things are, competition, who else is playing. With the competition, I just want to say one thing, there's a lot of different ways that people present their competitive matrix. And some people have, here's company 1, 2, 3, 4, and here's feature 1, 2, 3, 4. Our company has all green check marks, and all the other companies have, all red X's. And that's not always the best way to present. Sometimes you can actually present competitive advantage by leaving something out and pointing out that you have a red X because there's something that others do that you don't. So don't just fall into that trap of just using the typical green check mark thing. Legal is important, and I'll just say legal is probably the area, and I of course know nothing about Macedonian law, but in the US it's super scary with employment law, with the assignment of rights. If somebody works for you and they code for one afternoon, they have rights maybe to all of your software. So getting that assignment of rights as part of the sign-on, and I know this is probably not here, but I'll just say I'm sure there's all sorts of other gotchas where you should talk to a startup attorney and they will tell you these 10 or 20 documents you need to make sure you don't make these basic mistakes. Financials, full set of performance, all of those, the details we talked about 2 days ago. Exit strategy should be exit strategy canvas, including maybe some extra detail about comps and relationships. Valuation, just going through the things we did yesterday. And then the disclaimer we have at the end saying, we give you this information and take it with a grain of salt. It's up to you. So that's the key parts. Just pause. Any questions about that? Does anybody have other things they like to see? So here's the important thing. Some people will just sort of say, oh, somebody did a due diligence report, check, I don't need to read it, they did it already. So my message to investors who get reports from others is, it's not due diligence itself, it's just one artifact. Due diligence is it's a process of looking many artifacts and relationships. So just seeing a report doesn't count. All right, so now moving into phase 5. Once we've done due diligence, once it's complete, that's when we can actually start negotiating the deal. So we have all of the facts, we understand the market, we've assessed the financials, we've assessed the team, gone through risks. Now we are ready to do a term sheet. There are some companies who come to me and say, well, I'm not going to go through all that work of doing due diligence with you without a term sheet. And in some regards, I'm like, sure, I'll give you a term sheet, and we'll talk about this in just a minute. Term sheets are totally non-binding. It doesn't really mean anything. But how am I going to do a term sheet when I don't even know, what this company is worth, or, how am I going to? It would be an absolutely useless document. And so, typically, obviously, you would go through due diligence before negotiating that. One other thing. Negotiation and deal closure itself is part of due diligence. So I have had deals fall apart because of the way that the company was negotiating, where maybe we had come to soft agreements on how much valuation was and things like that during due diligence, and suddenly it's twice as much when we come to actually doing the documentation. And it's just sometimes, weird surprises that pop up like that. So the way that the negotiation works, is it a partnership where you're trying to figure out terms that make it work for everybody? Or is it somebody they just think, oh, now I'm negotiating, I need to optimize every little bit. And so the negotiation process itself could be a go, no go moment. And I had one interesting negotiation where the founder's wife was the chief attorney at a national law firm in the U.S. with a huge multi-story, office downtown, very fancy. So one of the smartest attorneys in town, and this guy took our term sheet and it looked like he took it to his real estate attorney or something. And he started rewriting and defining all of the terms, and I'll tell you when we get to this why that's so strange. But he was like negotiating how the terms were worded as opposed to just looking at what it was that we were negotiating. And the fact that he was married to this top attorney in town and that he was getting this kind of legal advice made me think, this is really going to be a bad situation. And we ended up not investing. And 4 years later, I saw him doing another round at exactly the same valuation he was trying to get to us, from 4 years ago. So clearly not doing well. So after you write the check, is due diligence done? No, it keeps on going. It never stops. So the things that happen after the check is written, of course, we're looking at how the company is performing. But we're also looking at, are they giving us regular reports? Are they communicating well? Are we acting as partners? And not surprisingly, some companies never give us reports, even though we have a term in the term sheet called information rights, where they're legally bound to give us quarterly reports at a minimum. And some companies go away for 18 months. It's kind of like a whale, can go underwater for a long, long time. And then it comes up again 18 months later, and they want to raise money, and that's the first time you hear from them. So that is bad meta due diligence, when you don't communicate with companies. For angels anyway, you need to think about the investment is as much experience as it is finance. Angels like to be engaged in the process and get meaningfulness out of the relationship with the companies they invest in. And when there are no updates, then that closeness that you had when they wrote the check gets farther and farther, and they're not likely to reinvest. So just quick thing on ethics. On both sides, I have seen investors who are not ethical in how they do due diligence. They might misrepresent their interest, or even just, you make a no decision, you should just go ahead and say no. A quick no is a gift to a founder. Same thing for entrepreneurs. Obviously, being truthful is important. So both parties, again, this is a partnership. It is not an adversarial relationship. Last thing for investors to ask is the grab bag question. And maybe the founder is thinking, oh, please don't ask about whatever it is, my patent application that just got refused or whatever it is. The grab bag question is just, look, is there anything else that would be material that we haven't asked you that we should know? And if further due diligence at the end shows that there was something, again, that's total red flag, game over. So, all right. So that was a quick overview on due diligence. And again, everything we've been doing all week is sort of, that's the deep part and the meat part of due diligence. But the questionnaires and the list for founders, you'll all have access to those. And this idea of putting it all into data room. By the way, data rooms, there's a bunch of different types. There's, Dropbox and Google Drive and all of those where you can give access to people. But there's also some products like LightServe that will allow you to see who is accessing which documents and for how long. And it gives you some good insights into how interested an investor might be. They're more expensive. It might cost $100 a month for that. But if that information is worth it to you, then that's something you might think about. There are others that are ridiculously expensive, $1,000, $5,000 a month. You don't want those. All right. Any other questions? By the way, due diligence is a huge area, and I've covered, really this is a pretty superficial discussion we just had. Is there anything else that people would like to add, or experiences you've had, or things that I didn't cover that you have questions about? Okay. Well, let's take 10 then, 10 minutes, and it's 1:15, so actually we'll take 13. We'll come back at 3:30 and we will dive into term sheets. And with term sheets, one thing I'll just let you know, we'll give you a sample term sheet. It's a US term sheet, so I am learning. I will figure out, by listening to you how things are done here. But we'll give you that sample US term sheet and we will go through term by term and let you know how that works, because I have zero capability to tell you how terms will be negotiated here. So see you in a few minutes. If you're going and getting your teeth cleaned with your dentist and you talk them into investing, well, they don't know what a term sheet is, and so founders need to have that put together beforehand. So I'm going to go through a bunch of things about term sheets. Like, we'll go through each of the terms on a typical venture capital term sheet. I'll talk about some of the alternative deal structures like convertible debt and safe notes. I'll talk about sort of context of how are our term sheets used in the deal making process, and it's maybe a surprise to some of you. And then we'll talk just a little bit at the end. I'll just review really quickly capitalization tables, because that's often attached to a term sheet. So, term sheet in itself, most of the time it's about a 3, 4, 5 page document. I've seen them as short as 1 and as long as 20 pages, but the whole idea is that this is usually a 3 or 4 page document, and each of the terms takes up maybe this much of a page. So it's meant to be a condensation of a bunch of other documents. So it is something where you can easily look through the terms, see what the deal is without looking through dozens of pages of legal jargon. Here are the other deal documents that it impacts. So once the term sheet is negotiated and all of the major terms of the deal are agreed upon, well, some people think you can just sign that and give somebody a check, but the term sheet itself is not the contract. It is going to inform the stock purchase agreement, which is, and it's not like the length matters, but just to give you context, that's usually a 35 page document, stock purchase agreement. And that is the actual contract that says we are selling stock, we are buying stock, it's this type of stock, these are the rights and opportunities tied to it. So that's the main place a lot of these terms are going to go. The next is the investor rights document. Sometimes this is built into other documents, sometimes it is a standalone document, and it will say, basically, here's all of the rights that investors have, and it could be things like information rights, that you'll get quarterly updates or even monthly updates. You'll get financials, what will be in those updates. It could be what rights do the investors have to come on the business premises, ask questions, all of those things. So that will be delineated there. And it's important because I've seen actually where investors think, well, I'm an owner of this company. I can just walk in anytime I want. And that is not necessarily the case. The next thing that is one of the deal documents is the board consent. And this is basically, if we are issuing new shares of a company, then of course the board needs to have a vote to say, yes, we authorize the issuance of these new shares. So that's a document showing that they have authorized that. And stockholder consent is on the other side. And I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but we will get to talk about preferred shareholders versus common shareholders. And when we're talking about stockholder consent, not only does the board have to say, yes, we authorize that this company will issue new shares for this investment round, but the other preferred shareholders need to vote and say at least half of them or 2/3, depending on how it's written. They need to say, yes, we consent that these shares will also be issued. Other things, accredited investor affidavit. If people are investing, I've seen some people, you just check a box and say, yes, I'm accredited, and they're perfectly happy. Other times they want multiple pages. There's a whole questionnaire about your investment sophistication, but that can be part of the deal documents. And then there's the certificate of incorporation, articles of incorporation, bylaws. This might have things like how many board seats are there? And one of the things we negotiate in the term sheet is how many board seats are there and who are the people who will be filling those board seats. So when you think about this term sheet, which is 3-4 pages, it is leading to the creation of all of these other things. So once investors, entrepreneurs come to agreement, term sheet goes to the attorneys, they take usually a week or so and they come up with all of this stuff, and then you have a big signing, usually docu-signing these days, and then wiring of funds, and you can close the deal. So this is the first important thing, is term sheet itself is not the contract, it leads to the development of the contract. And if you were negotiating all of these things, it would be an absolute mess and it would be really hard to negotiate. So the term sheet is really just there to facilitate by finding out what the key things are that are going to impact this deal. All right, the other thing about the term sheet is, I think I might sign, 1 or 2 term sheets a year, just when somebody is very insistent that I sign it. But for the most part, I don't feel a need to sign a term sheet. I would just send them out or whatever, I'll share them, and we will come to agreements on terms, and then that will go into all of those aforementioned documents, and then I will sign those. Some people do sign them. There are a few things that are binding, but almost all of the things there, it's not binding. You can sign term sheets all you want, and it doesn't commit you as an investor to actually write a check for the deal. So it's like a letter of intent, but not a contract. But here are 4 things that actually can be binding. And one would be if the investor has asked for a no-shop clause. And a no-shop clause, and I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit, but this is a term in the term sheet sometimes. And what it says is, all right, Mr. Founder or Ms. Founder, you and I are coming to an agreement, and if you agree to this and sign this term sheet, you agree that you're not going to go out and talk to all of these other investors and shop the deal. Well, why would an investor do that? Well, the good reason is they're going to go and do due diligence, and they might spend as much as $50,000, or in some cases even more, to do the diligence on this company, and they don't want to come back after a few weeks of doing that and then have the founder say, oh, yeah, forgot to tell you, we just took $5 million from these other guys. And that happens, so that's that's the main reason why no shop clauses exist. I have seen, however, unscrupulous investors use no shop clauses to tie up a company for up to 90 days even, or even more, which is a long time. By the way, a no shop clause should typically be just 30 days. If somebody needs more than 30 days to do due diligence, that's probably longer than I would sign as a startup founder. But I've seen where companies will investors will tie up a company for 90, 120 days, and then of course, at the end of that, the company is out of cash and running on fumes and really in trouble, and so now they will negotiate a tougher deal on what they're going to do. And well, I won't tell that story. So no shop clause, that's enforceable. Confidentiality, that may be part of a term sheet, not uncommon, that would be enforceable. Legal expenses, if there are legal expenses, typically when I do them, it just says each party will pay their own legal expenses. But if there are legal expenses incurred in the process, that would be enforceable. And then this last one, it's a term that I made up called the right to participate. And what it is it's almost a fractional no shop. It says, look, I just did all this diligence. I just led this deal and I really want to be in on it. And you're going to raise $3 million. I want $500,000 of it. So I carve out this little bit that says, all right, I'm going to keep on going and raising, but you, Peter, get $500,000 worth of this. And it's kind of like a partial no shop. I want people to go out. I actually help people go raise the other $2.5 million, but I want to make sure that I did all that work. I actually get the investment that I wanted to make. Okay, so who prepares the term sheet? The traditional answer is the investor prepares the term sheet. And certainly with VCs, they spend a lot of time with our attorneys coming up with a term sheet that we're comfortable with. And we don't, there's little nuances and changes in term sheets from, one attorney to another. We don't want to have to go and have a full legal review of every deal we do. So we will typically prepare the term sheet and present that to the company. Angel investors, if I have my angel hat on, I don't care if there's a term sheet that's already out there and I look at it and it makes sense to me, great, I'll just accept that. I put this slide in here though because my recommendation to founders is to create your own term sheet, to fill it out completely, 100%, and you can actually, we're going to go through each term. You can kind of think about each thing what you would do as we do this today. And why do I suggest you do that? Well, not because if you're going to have a meeting with a VC, you obviously wouldn't give them your term sheet. But if you were getting your teeth cleaned and met with your doctor or dentist, maybe you would have a term sheet and you could get a deal going with them very quickly. So if I was raising money, I would just always have my term sheet in my pocket and go from there. The other reason I recommend that startup founders prepare their own term sheet is there is nuance. There are subtle differences in a lot of these terms, like liquidation preferences. For founders here, would you rather have participating or non-participating liquidation preference? Anyone? Participating? Non-participating? Exactly. That's exactly the right answer. So this is why you would want to go through the trouble to fill out your own term sheet, because guess what? The difference between participating and non-participating liquidation preference could be millions of dollars, at a time of an exit. So it will make a material difference. Answer for investors, by the way, participating. Answer for founders, non-participating. But we'll get into that. So my recommendation is fill it out. You will then become, by having done that, more familiar with the terms, and it helps to level the information and experience disadvantage. Investors are seeing these all the time. They're very familiar with them. Founders should be too. All right, so when does the term sheet come into play? We just talked about due diligence. It comes into play after due diligence. So that's when it happens. But I'll just tell you, in my experience, I start the negotiation process probably at step -3 before, when somebody's even applying to pitch, or we're talking to them, we're going through the Pitch Academy training like we did last Friday. I'm learning about the company, I'm thinking about them, and frankly, by the time we get to the term sheet, usually we have already discussed 90-something% of the terms, and it really becomes a fairly quick process of just documenting what we have been talking about for a few weeks already. So usually, in most cases, like we can sit down, do it on Zoom in less than an hour. So it's not a necessarily, or weeks and weeks, depending on the deal, but often in as little as an hour if it has been something we've been talking about. All right, so there are two big things the term sheets do. They talk about money and control. Who's going to control the decision-making processes, and where does the money come from? Where does it go to? So let's talk about some common terminology. The first one is, before we ever even start, you've heard me a few times this week talk about safes, convertible notes, or straight equity deals. And then there's a few others. We talked about RBI, revenue-based investments, on Monday with the exits workshop, but that has a whole separate term sheet about how that works. KISS, we were just talking about that. You've seen 4 or 5 of them. I've seen 1. Not very common, but safes and convertible note, super common in the US, India, UAE, all of these other places. And then equity, within equity, there are either common equity deals or preferred. So let's just talk about this for a second, and I don't forget if I have a separate slide on common and preferred, but let's talk about it now. So just the quick answer, common stock is founder's stock, preferred stock is investor's stock. So we have 2 classes of stock, and when people create LLCs, for example, you might have 2 classes of membership units. You might have common membership units and preferred membership units. So why are there these 2 types of stock? Why can't you just have everybody have common stock? I keep talking about being aligned. Shouldn't everybody have the same type of stock to be aligned? Well, there's a couple of reasons, and I think people believe that the main reason we have preferred stock is because of liquidation preferences. And I'll talk more about those in a bit, but liquidation preferences say that preferred shareholders get their money first in any sort of a winding up or liquidation event, and then everybody else divides that up pro rata. And we'll talk more in detail about some of the nuances of that. So preferred stock has to be there to say who are the people who are going to get the first bite of the money versus everybody else. But there's some other things that are really important, maybe even more important in many cases than liquidation preference, and one would be this issue of control. And if you think about it, startup founders typically after the first raise will still own 75% of the company, right? The typical raise might be 20-25% equity in the company. So they're going to have the greatest, so in terms of stock votes, they will always win. And it's not uncommon that 2 people friendly, either in the company or friendly with the company, 2 out of the 3 board members, and I'll talk more about board dynamics in a minute, but maybe 2 out of 3 are friendly to the company. So now they got board majority, shareholder majority. So all of a sudden you start to see Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, and they're going to issue 1 million shares of, preferred Class B stock or whatever, and the investor's stock is worth 0. Or they could start voting to add more board members. They could start voting to doing all sorts of things that would be adversely against the interests of investors. So this idea of preferred shares are also there because just by by definition and structure, at first, founders will have all the power. Now, we don't want to give all the power to investors either. We want to have a balance of power. So typically, and I'll show you this when we get to the section about how this works, but there will just be something that says, look, in order to issue new shares of stock, you need 50% of preferred shareholders to say yes. So it makes it so things can be fairly simple. Anybody else have other experiences, by the way, about common versus preferred? But those are the main reasons, about control and about the liquidation preference. Yeah?
Quick comment. In our law in Macedonia, when it comes to the LLCs, there is no common stock of preferred stock. They're all the same.
Just all member units.
So if it's a joint stock company, in that case, there is a common stock of preferred.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. All right, so let's just talk about these other types. And let me talk about sort of what I've seen over the last decade. It used to be the case that almost all deals were equity deals in the US. And then, around, I don't know, maybe around 2007, 2010, convertible notes became super popular. And why were they popular? Instead of doing 35 pages of stock purchase agreement and changing to bylaws and all of these things, you could, in 3 pages, have a note payable with a couple of conversion terms, and you could, there's maybe only 3 or 4 variables in how you negotiate a deal with a convertible note, and you could raise money and be on your way. It's simplified the process. You still have to come up with a valuation, but you have a valuation cap or the discount, which we've talked about. There's some people here today. Does anybody not know how a convertible note works? I can quickly describe it. Okay, I'm going to go through that then. So, here's the deal. A regular note, well, actually, let me tell you why regular debt is not on this list. Because you might think, why don't you just give a loan to a company? And the reason is that regular debt, at least in the US, we have usury laws which say you can't charge over 35% interest. You cannot legally charge over 35% interest. And we've said repeatedly, VC, risk and having capital tied up, all of those things, we need to have that 58% target, 10x in 5-year type of thing. So we can't issue debt and get enough interest to have it make sense. So we have convertible debt instead. And the way that convertible debt works is it's just like that regular note. You loan somebody $1 million, 8% interest, end of the year, pay $1,080,000, you're done. But with convertible notes, you have two factors that will determine how this note will convert into equity. So when I do a convertible note, I'm definitely not investing just for the 8%. That would be really stupid. And I have seen some convertible notes where the founders have tried to sneak in, they have a right to repurchase the note at any time and pay all the interest and be done. Well, I would never, ever, ever sign that, because at 8%, I will lose my shirt as an investor. I will not do very well. So the conversion will usually happen when the next round of funding happens. Usually it'll say something like a round of $1 million or greater will cause my note to convert into equity. And so all $1,080,000, meaning my principal plus my interest, in most cases, will become equity. And how do we determine how much equity I get for that? Because it might be several years after I made the investment that this conversion occurs and this follow-on round happens. And so there's 2 things. I have valuation cap, which we talked about yesterday. The way to calculate the valuation cap is to calculate the equity valuation. What would you pay if you had done an equity deal? That amount is what the valuation cap should be. There would be no reason to pay a penny more for a company just because 2 years later they raised for twice as much money. It still was, you're investing at the risk at the time that you write the check. So valuation cap is the first thing, and then the second was the conversion discount. And that means if the next round happens at a $10 million valuation, I would only pay $8 million valuation at that time. So as an investor, I choose the better of those two. So if it's a $5 million cap and 20% discount on 10 million follow-on round, I choose, would I like to pay 5 million or 8 million? 5 million. So I'll choose the lower of those two things that would be advantageous to me. So discount, the discounts are really just there as downside protection. If the company doesn't grow and there's a follow-on round, it's only grown 20% or less, then I will take that discount. So I really don't want to do the discount. I expect to convert at the cap. All right, so that's convertible notes. Now we have SAFEs, which stands for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. So it's not equity, I'm not buying equity, and it's not debt. So we call them SAFE notes sometimes, but they are not a note payable or a debt instrument. All it really is I am paying money with the same thing, a cap or a discount, just like a convertible note, but it's not debt. And when that next round or conversion incident occurs, then I will convert at the better of that cap or discount. The thing to keep in mind is if it's not debt and the company goes out of business, well, debt is usually first in line. So if I have convertible debt, I'm in a better position than if I have equity, where I would get maybe zero. SAFE, you also would not be first in line for distributions of funds in a disadvantageous winding down of the company. So it's not as good in terms of security. And then of course, at least in the US, with equity, if I structure the deal right, I pay zero tax, but with these things, I have to give almost a quarter of my money to the tax man. So I don't want to invest in something where I have to give a quarter of the money away. If any of you are starting US companies, a Delaware corporation, one thing to keep in mind is that these tax breaks work for founders too. So I'm always wondering, why do founders do convertible notes or SAFEs? Because they have to give almost a quarter of their profits when they exit to the government for tax. Why wouldn't they want to do an equity deal? And convertible note, why would you want to pay $80,000 every year, of interest? And you're not paying it in cash, but it's diluting you by $80,000 a year. Some people tell me, well, Peter, it's so much cheaper to do a convertible note because the legal cost might be just a couple of $1,000s versus an equity deal might be $15,000 of legal. But that's sort of weird savings, right? $2,000 versus $15,000 in order to spend $80,000 a year in interest doesn't make sense. All right, are those vehicles good? Yeah. What is the difference between SAFE and convertible? Yep. The main thing is, this is actually debt. It is money that is owed by the company back to the investor. SAFE is not. It's just, it's like almost like buying a warrant or an option to convert into equity in the future, but without interest and without actual debt that would be due to an investor. So, and it was meant, what's funny is this was meant to be super fast and simple, but man, a lot of these SAFE notes are actually pretty complicated when you start reading the documents themselves. So I don't think simple agreement is really a good name for them. All right, any other questions about these types of structures? I'm going to go on and continue. When I talk about term sheets, I'm going to be talking about equity term sheets, because you don't need a term sheet. I've actually seen it, but I don't know why. You don't need a term sheet for SAFEs or convertible notes. They're just usually, relatively short documents themselves. There's only two things you're really negotiating is, the duration of the note, the interest rate cap, and I guess 4 things, and the discount. So not much in there. Yes?
Yeah, maybe you can talk about post money versus pre money, maybe, because now more or less everybody is doing post money.
Post money safes.
Safe, yeah.
Yeah. So one thing about safes, by the way, that has led to this conversion is a lot of people will raise money on safes in what's called a rolling close, where I put in 25K, you put in 25K, you put in 50K, you put in 10K, maybe all a month apart. And, I talked yesterday about how investing without a minimum is a huge risk to investors and founders, because maybe you haven't raised enough money to accomplish the milestones you need to get to your next raise. So, but it also gets really complicated because people just have a forever open safe, and they just keep raising and raising and raising. And the idea of having the post money safe is it sort of sets that cap on how much it will be raised. If it's 6 million post, 5 million pre, that means they'll be raising $1 million in that. Did you have any other insights about the benefits of post money?
Yeah.
It's definitely better.
Yes. Before 2 years, mostly they were doing pre money.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as you said, founders abuse it a little bit. So you say like 5 valuation pre-money plus 1 million raising, so this is 6 million post. So what they said, then they continue the period, they are keep raising, maybe he raised 2 million or 3 million, then you are not getting the right valuation exactly.
Yeah.
So 2 years ago, I think both Y Combinator and like 500, they no more do pre-money valuation. They most of the time do post-money, because as you said, they cap it, and then they can, where to convert. You are converting at this valuation, so you know exactly how much equity you will get against your loan.
Exactly. So almost all safes that are done now are post monies.
Yes.
Yep. All right. So now we are walking through the term sheet here. At the top of the term sheet, what's the first term? It'll say equity. And so you'll see a title across the top of the term sheet that says something like sale of Series Seed Preferred Stock. So this is interesting because first it's saying it's preferred, and it's also saying it's Series Seed. So you've heard me talk about Series A, Series B, Series C. So each round of funding has its own name. And I've seen all kinds of weird things: Series Pre-Seed, Series Seed 1, Series Seed 2, Seed A, Seed B. Doesn't really matter, but you are basically, these documents will give a name to a series. And though the investors in that series will have the rights and terms that will be in this term sheet. So this is one important part, is we're just distinguishing this from follow-on rounds or previous rounds. And then, of course, if it's convertible debt, it'll have the proposed terms. So issuer, of course, you need to say who's selling the stock. And the important thing here is sometimes the company is operating under a DBA, or doing business as. And sometimes it's the term sheet when I first find out what the real legal name of the company is. I guess that's not totally true. I find it in due diligence, but this is where they have to put the real legal name that the company is operating under. And then it will say whether it's an LLC or a C Corp or whatever type of entity that it might be, partnership, whatever. I won't go too much into US corporate structures, but I'll just say usually it's either going to be a C corporation, which is sort of professional grown-up corporation, or an LLC. Almost never will you see what's an S corporation, which would be sort of like if you're an accountant or a CPA or a attorney, just as an individual business, you might be an S corp. Like I have a S corp for consulting. It's just tax thing, but you would never invest in an S corporation. All right, so next thing, not surprising, we're going through the easy terms now. So how much are you raising? That's the first thing that will show up here. So, but the raising gets complicated when you look at this concept of almost no raise ends up being what is first stated. So if you're raising $1 million, You're probably going to raise a little bit under it, maybe 850, or a little bit over it. You might oversubscribe and sell 1.1 million. And so we have some terms here that will say, well, we're raising 1 million, but we have to get, let's see. Oh, well, okay. We'll just go with what it says on the slide. So we're raising $500,000. And it says that we have to raise at least $300,000 before we can have a first close. So what does that mean, first close? Founders, of course, are like, we want the money, we want the money, we want the money, and they would like to have a rolling close, but we say, no, we don't want that, it's too risky. So we'll say, look, if you raise 300 of the 500, at that point we can release the money out of escrow, we'll give it to the founders, we'll do a first close, and then you can spend a few more months to raise that additional $200,000. So that's what that first close means. And don't get tied up in these numbers. It might be that we're raising 1.5 million and 1 million releases for first close. But this is fairly common when companies really want to get money going quickly. But it also needs to be high enough to offset risk. So in this case, if it was $300,000, we would want to make sure that that the company could grow to the point where it reached the milestones. It might just take them longer to get there, but to the milestones where they would qualify for the next funding round. Another sort of minimum here is it will often say, what's the minimum amount that any one investor can put in? So it might say, if you don't have 25K, you can't come in, or 50K or 250K. There's lots of different minimums. For angel deals, it's usually about 25K, sometimes 50. And the reason that a founder would change that number around is they don't want 1,000 people on the capitalization table who put in $1,000 for $1 million raise. That would just be an absolute mess, hard to manage, and of course it would be very scary for follow-on VCs who would probably not touch that deal, having so many people on the cap table. So you might specify a minimum just so that you don't end up with too many people on the capitalization table. Okay. All right, so price and pre-money valuation. So there are a lot of different ways that this will show up on different term sheets. So we talked yesterday about coming up with a pre-money valuation that looked something like $4 million or $4.5 million, but often you don't see that number. You will see something like 37 cents per share. And depending on how the attorneys who wrote this up are doing it. And sometimes it can take you a long time to figure out what the pre-money valuation is, because you have to figure out, all right, well, how many shares are outstanding? How many shares are being offered? And at 37 cents, what does this mean? I really like it when somebody will just say, offering at a pre-money valuation of 4.5 million, which is the same as 37 cents per share. They can include both. Rarely do I see post-money valuation, but you do sometimes see it on an equity deal. You can kind of do the math. If the pre-money was 4 million and they're raising 1 million, of course the post-money valuation would be 5, but there's not a lot of reason to put that on a term sheet. All right, any question about those three? Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. I'll just say, maybe as I go through, I'll flag some. There are some things that are highly negotiated and some things that are not negotiated at all. So these numbers, the amount of the raise, the minimum, and sometimes the minimum investment, these are fairly highly negotiated. Valuation, of course, is the most highly negotiated term of the term sheet. Closing date, moderately negotiated term. And here's the strategy is it's probably not going to be the right date. So people will want a time that is far enough out that they can actually get investors to actually all pool together on the same terms at the same time, but not so close that, I get some people who come to me and say, Peter, I got this great deal, we're closing on Friday. And I'm like, Good for you. I can't jump in that fast. So the amount of time is usually between 30 and 90 days. That's sort of a normal amount of time. And it's not unusual for a company to go over the 90 days, in which case they have to come back to the people who have signed on to the term sheets to say, can we have another 90-day extension or 60-day or whatever it is they need. So this really just sort of is there to put a little bit of pressure on people to actually close the deal at a certain time, but it's not a hard date. Dividends is a rarely negotiated term in my world. Some people use dividends a lot, but for me, I see language like this. If there are profits that, if the dividends are declared by the board for common shareholders, then preferred shareholders will get them at the same rate. That's typically what this will say. Sometimes it will say, it will actually call out a rate and will say if common shareholders get dividends, then preferred will get them at 8%. I always think that's a strange thing. I think they should just say at the same price as common. There are other nuances to this. It could be cumulative, could be paid in cash, could be rolled into equity. There are a lot of different flavors. But for the most part, the main reason I see dividends in here is just to say, you guys get money, we get it as investors as well. I have seen, I've never done this, but I've seen where dividends can be used as protection against the walking dead. When we talk about the walking dead in our investment portfolio, these are companies who are not growing very fast and who have very little prospect for exit. This is the worst thing you can have in your portfolio as an investor. So what you might say is, after 5 years, dividends will be paid at 12% or some onerous amount, so that the founders, maybe they've been paying themselves a lot of money and are just sitting on a cash cow. It's good for them, but bad for everybody else. This is a way to at least start pushing some cash back out to investors and give some motivation maybe to exit. All right, now we got this big complicated one, and I'll show you a bunch of examples of how this works. So liquidation preference is probably one of the top 3 most negotiated terms in the term sheet. And what it's saying is that usually it's preferred shareholders get the first bite at the apple for distributions. But there's all sorts of different ways we can say that. The first is, well, how much money do they get back? Do they get a 1x liquidation preference, meaning if I put in $100,000, I get $100,000 back before anybody else gets anything? Or do I get a 1.5 or 2x, so I get $200,000 back before anybody else gets anything? The norm in the US now is 1x, but I see sometimes this term used for people who have come in to do a bridge financing before an exit. So for example, if you think your company's gonna exit in 6 months and you just need to raise a few $100,000, sometimes these people who come in at this last moment will ask for a 2x liquidation preference. They're gonna be in for not that much time. Maybe they're taking a big risk and they wanna be paid for getting into the deal. The other thing, and I'll give you some case studies about non-participating versus participating, but just the quick answer here is non-participating means we have an exit, I get my 1x of my investment back, and then I don't participate in the distribution of the rest of the money. Participating means I get my 1x back as an investor, and then I also participate in the distribution of the rest of the money. So if I own 20% of the stock, I get my 1x plus 20% of whatever money is left over. So it's a little bit of a double dip for investors. In the last few years, when entrepreneurs have sort of tipped and gotten the balance of power in the US and valuations have gone up and all of these things, the number of participating term sheets has gone down and non-participating has gone up. And now it's probably correcting back towards a mean where we're seeing more participating. But just those are the things that drive the market. All right, so here's an example. So investors invest $500,000 for 20% equity in the company. So that's $2 million pre, $2.5 million post money valuation. So what happens, this is not a good situation, what happens if the company sells for $1 million? So this is there's different things that happen with these liquidation preferences, with good exits for hundreds of millions of dollars or bad exits where it's below the valuation that we sold at. So if there's no liquidation preference, we get that $1 million. The investors bought 20% equity, so they get $200,000 because they own 20% of the company, and the founders get $800,000. So investors just lost $300,000, right? They invested $500, they get $200 back. So if there is a 1x actually I should go here. If there's 1x liquidation preference non-participating, they get their $500,000 back. The remaining $500,000 is distributed to the founders, okay? And then if you have participating, this is where the double dip occurs. They get their 500 plus 20% of the remaining 500, so they get 6 and founders receive 400. So is that pretty clear? So that's when there's the bad exit.
What if the company sells for below 500 for the middle?
Same sort of math. If the company sold for $200 or $100,000, then the investors would get $20,000, and the founders would get $80,000. In this case, so with either of these, if they exit for $100,000, the investors get all $100,000 because they get 100% of what's left over after they've taken all of the money, so it ends up being $100,000 in both cases. If this company instead sold for $10 million, we'd see different scenarios, right? Because now it's going to have been a 4x exit. So 10 million with no liquidation preference, then the investors would get 2 million, and the founders would get 8. And with, let's see, non-participating, they would get their 500,000 back. They probably wouldn't do that. And if it was participating, they'd get their 500,000 back plus 20% of $9.5 million. So whatever that is, 1.8 million plus their 500. So they get about $2.3 million. Okay, so it changes a little bit when it's a better exit. Okay. So this is what and I'll just say, I'm showing you how these terms work. But the language is really interesting. Once you have read through, say, 5 or 10 different term sheets, they're all worded just a little bit differently. And so you'll get to the point, once you've seen a bunch of them, where you're like, okay, in the event of liquidation, blah, 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 common stock, share 1x. So this is what, is jumping out to my eye. Okay, it's a 1x. I get what that is. Plus declared but unpaid dividends. Okay, got that. Or preferred does not participate alongside, so non-participating. So this is how you're pulling out the language, and it's just really those few key words. It's the 1x and participating or not. And this is why it was weird when the guy whose wife was an attorney was basically rewriting all the wording here, but really all you really need to say is liquidation preference, 1x, non-participating, boom. You don't even have to describe this when it's wound up and it goes from them to there. All right, so let's talk about conversion. So this is a term that is a almost never negotiated term. So it's always, or almost always, going to be 1-to-1, meaning my preferred shares can convert into common shares sometimes at any time. And if I have, 1,000 preferred shares, I can convert them into common whenever I want. So why would I want to convert my shares into common and give up my rights? Well, one reason would be if we're being acquired or having an IPO, we need to move to a single class of stock. But another would be if I don't take this 1x liquidation preference, if we have that $10 million exit, well, I have 1x liquidation preference, I get 1x non-participating, I get $500,000 back, right? Well, that sucks because I own 20% of the company, I should get 2 million. So what I do is I convert my preferred shares to common, and then I liquidate and I get my 20% of that 10 million. So that's one scenario where you would use a voluntary conversion. But again, this is usually it's a workhorse term, it's just always in there. There's no benefit one way or the other. And here, optional or automatic. This is important, like if you are having an IPO or something, you need everybody to convert. It can be made such that it just happens automatically, so you don't get one weird shareholder who is tying up your whole deal without responding or with refusing to convert. All right, so here's a conversion example. Oh, maybe I jumped ahead perhaps with this. So we invest $500,000 for 20% equity, and now company sells for $5 million. Which option's better for investors? Quiz for you. 1 or 2? 2? Anybody think 1? Well, let's look at it. So option 1, 1x liquidation preference, non-participating, so you get your 500K back. And if you converted to common stock, so you got 20% equity, so you own 20% of 5 million, so you get $1 million. So you get twice as much. So 2 is your obvious choice. Okay. So that's fairly normal. And that's what this term is going to say. And I'll say that it's rarely negotiated. I haven't seen anybody really try to pull a 2-to-1 or any other thing. But it does happen. It's not impossible. So things like changing articles, board, all of those things would require a vote. Speaking of boards, this is a term in the term sheet, and it will say usually the number of seats and then who will be in those seats. And in some cases, the who will be, Bob Smith, Nikola Tesla, whoever it might be, and we'll say them by name, or it might say them by the CEO of the company, the lead preferred investor, and a third party who's not a shareholder of common or preferred who would take that seat. So that's sort of the ideal, typical 3-person board. For pre-seed and seed, that's normal. And then when we get to Series A, we're typically going to grow the board up to 5 seats. And certainly I've seen seed rounds that have 5 seats or even 7, but that's a ridiculous number. So common, preferred, independent. One thing just I'll say is I've seen really nasty board meetings where people they think that it's their job as the preferred shareholder to stand up for the rights of the preferred stockholders. And that is not the case, even though they have been chosen to be the preferred board seat. They have to be having a fiduciary duty to the board itself or to the company itself, and they need to make all their decisions that are towards the benefit of the company. And people have been threatened of being sued for pursuing their own interests and so on. It kind of makes you think, well, why do we have to have board members from each side? And it's just to keep that balance of power. And I'll just speak, sometimes you'll see board observers listed in the term sheet. And what that is say you have a 3-person board, then you might have an observer who doesn't get a vote on the board, but who attends the board meetings and really does more than observe. They can participate and comment and work with the CEO offline. They can do all of these things just like a regular board member, but they don't get that vote. So board observers, sometimes when a company goes from Series Seed to Series A, maybe that one of those Series Seed board members was really a great contributor, but we need to bring on 2 new board seats for the Series A, then we might kick out that Series Seed board seat, but we really like them, so we'll just keep them on as an observer. So that's why you might see that listed in the term sheet. Any questions about board seats? Crystal clear? All right, so let's talk then about the protective provisions. So this can be the longest in terms of page length term of all of the terms in the term sheet. And that's because there may be as many as 6 or 10 different protective provisions that go into this list. So these are things, this is the thing I was referring to when I talked about preferred versus common, but these are the things that give preferred shareholders their balance of power with founders. So, and it will say things like, without 50% vote, these things can't happen. So examples, you can't change articles of incorporation or bylaws. That makes sense. Shouldn't just be able to change those. Increase or decrease the number of shares. That makes sense. You don't want to create weird dilution scenarios. Board of director changes. And then things like in operations, one that you see pretty commonly is a debt limit, where, and this is one that needs to be negotiated carefully, because I've seen where it's negotiated too low and it actually harms the ability of the company to operate. So typically, if it's a pre-seed company, you're raising $1 million, you might see a debt limit of $100,000, $200,000. And just need to remember when you do the next rounds that it should be $500,000, $750,000, or $1 million, so that you don't hamper the ability of the company to run. I saw one investor who demanded that he co-sign any check over $5,000. And this investor was somebody who traveled all around the world, was not really reachable in most cases. And the company went out of business. I don't know if it was because of that, because of the check writing, but it could be because follow-on investors like us said, this is crazy. It could be really dangerous to a company if we can't pay our employees, or we can't write checks for $5,000. This is going to be really bad. So we did not invest. Company didn't raise money, went belly up. So sometimes when investors push for weird and overly stringent terms, it ends up hurting them as much as, more than protecting them. Let's see, any other protected provisions? I think those are the main ones. All right, information rights, I mentioned this earlier. This is basically saying, how often are you going to get information, what kind of information, and in what format will you get it? This is, I'll just say, a large percentage of companies we invest in, they sign this, and maybe we get half of the information we're supposed to. How about you guys? Do you get 100% of updates on your investments?
If you twist their arm.
Twist their arm, yes, exactly. Well, I'll just say from an investor side, and first of all, entrepreneurs, definitely you should do it because you'll never get the follow-on round. But what I found is sometimes investors are soft on that first report, and that's what causes the bad behavior. You got to say, look, it's been 90 days, got to have that report, and if you sort of show that expectation from the beginning, you get better results. All right, pro rata. This is one that can be highly negotiated. Oh, actually, let me go back. I have one other thing I wanted to say about this. So this all looks good. I've described this as balances power, so that you have to vote for new shares and all these things so that nothing bad happens. None of you really said, well, wait a minute, what about, maybe does this tip the balance of power too far? And I'll just let you know, I don't think so, but I did have one negotiation recently where they said, well, you basically can control whether we can raise another round or not. You can say, nope, no more raises. And they were unwilling to have virtually any of the protective provisions because they thought it gave us too much control. And I was like, well, let's talk through these scenarios. If you need to raise money and I say you can't, I'm just killing my investment. Why would I do that? But in your case, if you can increase the number of shares without my vote, you could do something super unethical and make my shares worth almost zero. So the likelihood of me doing something is really low. And actually, I trusted this person, so I didn't think they were going to do this. But just, if we're looking at the balance of these legal documents, this is the kind of thing you would think about: is what can happen in the worst case scenario if you don't have these protective provisions. All right, so this one is a fairly negotiated term. It's one I always put in there. When I invest in a company, I want the right to invest again and again and again. When I invest in something and it is doing well, I want to increase my concentration in it. And you saw the distributions I showed you earlier this week of, there's just a few companies that are going to be getting the 10x. So if there's one that looks like it's on the path to 10x, I want to be, or 100x or whatever it is, I want to be able to maintain my pro rata and continue to support that company. It will be a good idea for me. So I put these pro rata investment options in here. It also gives me, as an investor or as a fund, risk diversification. So I invested in the first one. It was highly risky. Now I'm investing more money at lower risk and then more money at even lower risk. And it just changes the balance of risk in my portfolio. Okay. So why would founders not want this? So I said this is a moderately negotiated term. And sometimes founders say, well, we're not going to let you have pro rata rights because what if we have a Series A investor who wants to take the whole round? And my response is, well, then they can let us come in for the pro rata along with them. Usually there's space for that. So this is one of those due diligence in the negotiation. If somebody is really thinking, oh, well, what if they don't want that? Let's talk about that at that time. But for the time being, I want my pro rata rights. And if you don't value my investment, maybe you should find another investor. So believe it or not, that would be the kind of thing, if I wasn't really 100% bought in, I might walk on a deal just for not having pro rata. And if you think about it, a lot of people invest in safes, for example, just to be able to get pro rata so that they can keep on investing. It gets your foot in the door on something. So this is really an important term, I think, for investors. All right, yesterday we talked about an employee option pool. Here's one thing that's important. We're setting aside the employee options, but this usually included in the pre-money valuation. So meaning that if the option pool is issued after we've done our raise, we suddenly have a 10% dilution. So if we put in $1 million, we actually only have $900,000 worth of value in the company. So when this is written, we want to say, yeah, we'll do this option pool, 10% sounds good, but you put it in first, that's going to be part of the deal, and then we'll invest on top of that. So we know what valuation we're actually investing at. Now, if the next round, there's another draw on that employee option pool, of course we'll be diluted by that, even if it's in the pre-money valuation. All right, so here's a couple other ones. So if there's, let's see, who was it? Uber. Uber, of course, created lots and lots of value, and there were people who wanted to exit for a long time, and they couldn't because Uber said, we're not going to allow our transfer agent to allow people to exchange shares. And I actually don't know why that was the case, but it was. So this right of first refusal is, I wonder if that's right. Somebody just changed the slide, but it says if founders sell, then, oh, no, here's right. I'm sorry, wrong story. But if founders sell, investors have the first right to purchase those. So instead of founders selling outside of the thing, they can sell. Also, if founders sell, investors have the option to sell too. So this is where my Uber store came. So founders actually were selling Uber shares, but other investors couldn't. So if they had this co-sale thing, they'd say, yep, founders sell, we get to sell also. Or if founders sell, we can buy their shares. Drag along rights, pretty straightforward. This is really just made so that you don't have anybody screwing up your deals as you're, say, trying to get an exit. If you get a certain percentage, usually 50%, who want to sell the company, then the others will be dragged along into that transaction. All right, so getting down to the bottom of the term sheet, there's a bunch of sort of misc things here.
Comment on your diagram. Can you enforce in the United States minority or majority diagram?
Can you enforce majority drag along?
Minority or majority. So if minority has option to sell, to drag along the majority.
Well, usually this would say 50%, but it's a good question because what if it said 25%? I've never seen that. So it's a good question.
It's allowing you to exit the company if the majority shareholder, which is the founder, is not willing to sell.
Yeah.
You have a potential buyer,
Yeah,
which is existing only in, maybe 50 plus 1% or whatever.
right.
So to get to a majority, to have a package which will be sold eventually to the buyer.
Right. So, but it's I guess so long as, and your point is, if this says drag along rights can happen with 25%, but if somebody owns 75% of the shares, can they vote against the drag along provision? And that's a super interesting question, and I don't know. Because that would be a clear, I mean, both are principles that would work, right? And I don't know. It is a good question. Yes?
Yes.
Maybe you know.
There is a drag law sometimes is due to protect minority shareholders. So if I own 75, and I cannot say I want to sell, but you cannot sell as a minority. So this means dragging me with you. If you sell, I have the right to sell as a minority shareholder. So sometimes this is what is
Drag along actually means that you are obliged to sell, not you have the right to sell.
Okay.
Yeah.
I always think of it as like you're being dragged against your will, you know, into that transaction. All right. Well, interesting. I'm gonna ask my attorney about that next time we, you know, sometimes they've seen a lot of these weird transactions. Okay. So just a couple of things here. So in the term sheet, there will be something about assignment, and usually it will say something to the regard of, if I bought a bunch of shares, I can't just go and sell them to you. And one reason that a founder might not want me to do that is you might not be accredited, and now they have non-accredited people on the cap table, and that could be very bad. Or you could be a competitor, and now you're a shareholder in a competing company. Or they're just in a bad mood and they don't want anybody trading their shares. It just says basically that that they get to transfer. I'll say one thing that's interesting is when we invest through SPVs, we have 10, 20, 30, 40 people inside of a single purpose vehicle, and we often transfer inside of the SPV or even bring in new people into the SPV, and we will allow them to buy if somebody else wanted to sell. And the company can't control that because we, as the SPV, own all those shares, and it still remains owned by the SPV, even though in our internal cap table, we fairly frequently will transfer shares from one investor to another. Okay, and then conditions precedent to financing. Basically here, some of the things you'll commonly see is that there will be time for the investors to do due diligence, blah, blah, blah. But one that I actually demand sometimes is I want a company to convert from an LLC to a C Corp. And I'm happy to go all the way through my negotiation with an LLC. It's great for startups to start as an LLC, but of course to get my tax advantages, I want them to be a C Corp. So I'll put that in as a condition precedent to financing. I'm not going to invest in them until they do that. And that's a typical thing. And then expenses for legal counsel. So, and I don't know how it works here, but typically it says each party pays their own expenses, but the party that is paying typically for the stock purchase agreement to be written up is the founder. And the party that's paying for the term sheet to be prepared is typically the investor. And then the investor is also typically paying for a review if they don't have internal counsel that would review the stock purchase agreement and changes to bylaws and articles. So basically saying everybody pays for their own thing, but just keep in mind, usually it's the founder who pays the stock purchase agreement. Is that the same here for the most part? Yeah. Okay. I'll just say one other thing about this is when you have lots of, say, individual angel investors, sometimes rather than having 20 people all pay an attorney a couple $1,000s to look over a bunch of documents, we might say, all right, the founder has to pay for a single review, legal review of those documents by an attorney chosen by those investors, because otherwise, we don't know each other necessarily, and it makes it, it's certainly inefficient to pay for the same work 10 times over. All right, so I put cap tables in here because sometimes the cap table is attached to the term sheet. Why would that be? Well, the main and by the way, I see it not that often. It's in maybe 1 out of 20 or 30. So most of the time the cap table will not be there. But if way back up at the top, they had said the price is 37 cents a share, I may need to have the cap table to go down and do this math and figure out, well, how many shares are outstanding and what is the actual pre-money valuation that I'm investing at. And I probably have already gotten the cap table beforehand because that's one of my key due diligence documents that I'm going to be looking at. And I want to make sure that I know who else is on the cap table, if there's weird co-founders who've left or Uncle Bob or, strange things I need to know about. And so I'm really just, covering this quickly, but 2 things about cap tables. For the most part, you can just do them in Excel. It's just a table. It's going to have who are the founders, how many shares, are there any stock options or warrants, how many shares do they have. This one doesn't say what they paid, but I typically like to see what the cash in was. I think that's important. The other thing is, and it doesn't say it here, but if this is the cap table, you should also have some additional lines for convertible debt and anything that could impact the future cap table should be on here. So it should say convertible notes, $1 million, at a $5 million cap, or if there's a safe, it should say $1 million of safe or whatever it is at a $5 million cap, because I want to know once this thing converts, there's going to be a lot of other people jumping in. I want to know, who they are and what that is. The other thing is this shows Series A preferred investors, and it shows them all as a group. I really don't like that. Sometimes people and founders will say, "Oh, well, they need their confidentiality, so we can't share the names of people who are in this group." And I'm like, well, it's actually of material interest who these people are in the Series A group. So I want to know that as part of due diligence. And by the way, if somebody is really, really so concerned about their privacy, they should go form their own LLC and invest through that LLC, and then I can't figure out who they are. So that's bad on them. I'm not going to take that as an excuse. So I will say I love it when founders use a service like Carta, if you're familiar with carta.com. And what it is it's an online cap table management software, and they do a bunch of things for managing funds and on SPVs, but they also manage cap tables. And what's nice about it is you can go look at the cap table anytime, and there are a lot of mistakes that are made in cap tables, and I want to make sure that there are no strange changes being made without my knowledge. So Carta is very good for that. Also, when you have warrants, you get a little email every month that says, hey, your warrants or stock options have just vested another, 1.8%, and confetti comes down. It's kind of exciting. Let's see. So prevents things getting changed and being bad. Oh, the other thing nice about Carta is it does a 409A valuation for you every year. So as your company is growing and you're issuing stock options, you have a validated valuation for not that much money, about $2,500 a year. I know it sounds like a lot, but that's cheaper than doing a third-party valuation, and that allows you to use that number for issuance of those stock options. Okay. Other places to go for term sheets. This book, Venture Deals, is really good. It goes through everything we just did, talking about the terms, but it also does some of the conversation we did about what are the norms. And so it's one thing to know how a term works, but another thing to know what are you going to expect to normally see with a company. So that's really good. And of course, Venture Capital for Dummies by yours truly. I think it's chapter 19 or something, has a very, fairly straightforward conversation. And then this is a great resource. The National Venture Capital Association has gotten a bunch of attorneys and a bunch of VCs together, and they've created, it's really thick. It's like 25, 30 pages. It's every term known to man. So it's, and they give template language in it. So if you were, wanting to build a term sheet of your own from scratch, I would actually go to the NVCA, which is the well-established basic place to go for term sheet language. And you would never use all of the terms that are in there. You might use maybe a third of them, but it's kind of interesting to see what's there, and it's a great resource. Okay, so that is cap tables. Any questions, things I skipped, things you wish you knew about cap tables and term sheets that I didn't talk about? Crystal clear?
You said there can be minimums set when you're going on like future raising rounds, but if you use SPVs together on it, right? You can pull your money together and then the SPV invest.
Yes. So if there was, say, sometimes I see $200,000 minimums, and that's more than most angels probably want to write a check for. So yeah, then you could get 10 people in at $20K each, create an SPV, and then it invests, and that's fine. And that works for hitting the minimum, but one thing to keep about, and this is a US law, but when you hit 100 and 249 investors in your company, then you hit different levels of regulation and reporting that you need to do. So some people mistakenly believe that if you hide a lot of people inside of an SPV, that just because it's one line item on the cap table, all of those people actually count toward those regulatory and reporting minimums. So it's something to keep in mind. But it does solve the problem of how VCs perceive having all of these people on the cap table. And by the way, one of the reasons VCs are worried about having so many people on the cap table is, getting a vote done with tons and tons of people, it can slow things down, and sometimes there are times when you need to vote quickly. But also, you can have inexperienced angel investors who behave irrationally and want to sue and want to do all these things. And I've had this happen a few times, and as the SPV manager of hundreds of investments, I've had to sort of put the reins on unruly angel investors and say, well, you don't actually own any shares in the company. You own shares in this LLC, so you can't actually take this action without, and sometimes action is appropriate, and if all of the members want to do it, then that's great. But anyway, it reduces a lot of the noise, so it can be actually a very good thing. Good for founders especially, but that's why VCs don't like that. I've seen, by the way, companies have raised and they got 80 some people on the cap table, where even after the fact, maybe it's been 2, 3, 4 years since those first investors invested, they then create an SPV just to sort of clean it up. And so it doesn't necessarily need to happen exactly at the time of the investment. So, good question.
How does the SPV vote in the company? Because we have like internal votes in the SPV as well, and then, or we have like a manager of the SPV.
Yeah, so in my case, I'm the manager, so I vote. I mean, I will, of course, poll the members and say, what do you guys think? But yeah, then I issue the single vote on behalf of the pooled shares. And that makes it faster, easier for everyone. Okay, awfully quiet. Any last questions? Well, it looks like, bam, 5:02, ended right on time. Well, thank you all for your attention, not just today, but other days when you've been here. It's been a delight. We've got one more thing tomorrow, but this was the end of the masterclass series, and it's been really great sharing this stuff with you. Hopefully it's been a little bit useful, and love to see you come, form a Delaware C Corp in the States someday, and we'll talk term sheets. So, all right.